I'm going to hand back to Peter, I think, because we're going to have some more thematic discussion now about key topics which work across the different journals, which I think we all would like to address.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and the first thing that I think we'll talk about for maybe 5 minutes or so is the crucial squillion dollar question of what kinds of articles we're looking for, what we're looking for in our submissions. And I'm sure that many of the same things here will apply to all three journals. So the JRS in its policy statement says, and I think this is true and important, is that we're looking for papers that make a fresh and significant contribution to the understanding of the Roman world and have the potential to stimulate further discussion. Translated, what does that mean? Well, the way that I think about it with the JRS is that I would like to imagine that each year's issue of the JRS is something that could be read with interest and I hope pleasure from cover to cover by any Romanist. I mean, whether in fact anyone does read the journal from cover to cover other than me, I have no idea, but that's in a sense what I'm aiming at, that each issue of the journal, that every piece, no matter what topic it's on, would potentially be something that a Roman historian or a Roman literary scholar could read with pleasure and interest. So the distinction in saying what kind of papers we're after is not really a distinction between technical papers and non-technical papers. I mean, we publish every year some papers that are highly technical and others which could be read by a first-year undergraduate student. So looking back at the 2019 JRS, back to back, right next to one another, one has Alison Cooley's paper on the concept of the Augustan Principate, an article which I think could go onto a first-year undergraduate reading list on Augustus, immediately followed by a paper on fractional arithmetic in the Tabula Alimentaria of Valea, extremely technical paper focused on a particular text and a very particular problem in how arithmetic works within it. So we publish both highly technical and very, very non-technical papers. Nor is it really a distinction between very focused topics and very broad topics. Again, I think we do publish on both of those. Again, just in that same issue of the JRS, one has, not quite next to one another, a very, very focused paper indeed on Latin prose rhythm, so digital analysis of prose rhythm in Latin authors, and a paper on about the broadest theme imaginable, extraordinary piece by Brent Shaw on whether the Romans have a conception of the future, and if not, what that might tell us. Also, we publish texts sometimes that are focused just on one particular text, and papers that are engaging in very, very broad conceptual issues. So what do all these papers have in common? These technical, non-technical, very focused, very broad, a single text, much wider themes. Well, I think what all of these papers do is that they have the potential to have an impact on the field outside their narrow subject area. That is to say, all of these papers, I hope, are papers which could be of very wide interest to an audience of Romanists outside of people who are already specialists on Augustus or Latin prose rhythm or fractional arithmetic. Again, the way that I would imagine it, I don't know whether graduate journal clubs exist anymore, but if you had a graduate journal club with 10 graduate students who get together once a month, everyone reading one article from the same issue of a journal and presenting it to the others, I'd like to think that an issue of the JRS would work well for a graduate journal club of that kind. There are plenty of high quality kinds of research that we don't publish in the journal, and that tends to be research which is likely to be only of interest to a relatively narrow or small group of scholars. Doesn't mean it's not high quality research, just means that's the kinds of thing that's likely only to be of interest and significance to specialists. So, for instance, we would not be likely to publish a paper offering 30 new textual emendations in the text of Alexander of Aphrodisias's De Fato, even if all those emendations are completely convincing. It's just in the nature of a topic of that kind that it's not likely to be of that broad interest to Romanists outside of a relatively narrow specialized group. I've published plenty of papers in my own career which I wouldn't dream of submitting to the JHS or JRS, not because I'm not proud of those papers, but because they're a very targeted specialized interest to people who are interested in the epigraphy of Roman Anatolia. again, just looking at a couple of papers in recent issues of the JRS, and I think actually looking at recent issues of the journals is not a bad way of getting a sense of what we're looking for. So just looking at last year's JRS 2020, which in fact has a long string of articles by early career scholars. Of the 8 papers published in last year's JRS, I think 5 or 6 of them are by broadly early career scholars. Strongly recommend that all of you, any of you, have a look at Anna Bonnell-Frieden's superb paper on Censorinus's De Die Natali. It seems to me a really nice example of an article that's focused on a particular text, and a particular text that has not hitherto been very widely known or widely read among Romanists. It's a very focused article on that one relatively obscure text. But what I think Frieden does really brilliantly in that piece is show why this text, in fact, ought to be much more widely read and used by scholars interested in encyclopedism in the Roman Empire, Roman conceptions of time. And what I think she does brilliantly is start from this particular text, but open out into a whole series of wider problems of general interest to Roman historians. Or sitting right next to that, again in the same issue of the journal, Kat Humoller's piece, Freedom in Marriage, on manumission for marriage in the Roman world. There she's starting from a really sort of technical problem in Roman law, manumission of female slaves in order to marry their former owners. And again, there she starts from a very small, narrow technical problem, but opens out brilliantly into wider Roman conceptions of power relations within marriage and the different forms of manumission. Both of them, I think, really model cases of apparently technical topics treated in a non-technical way and showing why these apparently quite narrow problems might be of very, very broad interest to an audience of Romanists who might never have thought before about manumission for marriage or this particular text. And one final thing that I'd say about those 2 papers in particular, but this is true of almost everything published in the JRS, I think in both cases these papers went through 3 or 4 iterations before we finally published them. The initial versions that came in were very strong, very, very promising, but I think in both cases not in their initial form framed quite right. So I think for the Frieden piece on Censorinus, the initial version didn't have very much, just explaining what this text is. So the final version ended up with a much bigger section on just basically going through the text and telling the reader what's going on in Censorinus. And Kat Humoller's piece, I think it changed quite a lot over the course of the refereeing and re-refereeing process. In order to get the balance right between the particular case study with which it opens and the wider perspectives with which the paper ends. That's quite a common phenomenon, actually, in submitting to journals like ours, that papers will go through several versions when we try and get just the format and the tone right. Lynn, Naoise, do either of you want to add anything on the kinds of papers that we're looking for?
Yeah, if I could jump in there, Peter. I think virtually everything that you say for JRS is absolutely the same for JHS, and particularly this point about the balance between the specialist and the technical and the broad ranging. I mean, what we want are papers that, you know, a broad range of different people are going to want to read, and that doesn't mean it shouldn't be specialist. What we want is high quality, cutting edge research of whatever kind, but we also want it accessible and for the importance to a wide range of readers to really be brought out in exactly the way you explain. And similarly with JHS as to JRS, and Naoise will talk more about this in a minute, I think. A lot of our accepted submissions are early career scholars, which is absolutely fabulous to see. And I am very, very keen to support early career scholars in that regard. Just to mention a couple of really good model papers in terms of JHS. And again, remember, we publish archaeology and philosophy and history and literature and everything. One that really stands out for me is Julia Kind's paper in the 2015 issue, Personal Religion, a Productive Category for the Study of Ancient Greek Religion, ? It's a really good, provocative, well-researched paper that really pulls out and brings together a very interesting new approach to studying Greek religion in a very useful way. Again, would be terrific for, say, third-year undergraduates, but of interest much more broadly across the Greek world. And Peter's going to be really embarrassed when I say this, but the other person the article that really stood out for me last year, you're not allowed to hide, Peter, in JHS is Peter's article, Lysimachie and Lysistrata, which is a really nice study of the eponymous heroine of Aristophanes, Lysistrata, and how she evokes a historical person, Lysimachie, who was the priestess of Athena Polias. And it brings together not just the drama, the literary context of Lysistrata, but also the historical context, the epigraphical context and evidence that we have in just a really, really lovely way. It's just such a good read. And again, highly relevant for anybody studying classical Athens in that period, for coming at it from a number of different perspectives. Nish, did you want to add anything?
I think just to say we're, in Anatolian Studies, we're broadly the same as both JHS and JRS. I think we are really, what we need to see is papers with a fantastic sense of a research question, something which is of broader significance. Now, we get a lot of great submissions which have a lot of wonderful detail, often stemming from original research, new primary data, and that's fantastic. But for us, what we really want to see is we want to see that married to a novel argument, which is going to have implications beyond the immediate topic. And if I could just pick out one article from last year's volume, we've got one called "A Desolate Landscape, Mobility and Interaction in the Hora of Clazomenae During the Early Iron Age" by Elif Corporal and Rick Weissen. And this is a great article that brings together lots of primary new data, but builds much bigger discussions and conclusions about the rise of the polis, about the interaction between Asti and Kora within a Greek city-state. And so it's got much broader implications beyond Anatolia, but also for beyond the individual case study. Now, I'm going to stop there because I could talk about many other articles, but I know that we are short on time. So I am going to move seamlessly on to our next topic, if that is all right. In our preparations for this webinar, we've all agreed that some of our greatest articles which have the most exciting new ideas do come from new, novel, up-and-coming early career researchers. And this is one area that we're all very much keen to encourage to get even more submissions from. I think we all feel that what we do, if we know somebody is an early career researcher, we tend to try and put a little bit of extra effort into giving them extra support if they need to, how to change perhaps something which might have started off as a chapter in a PhD thesis, for example, the kinds of changes and transformations that needs to go to make it a standalone as a publishable research article. Sometimes that takes a little bit of extra input from us, and I think all of us would certainly say that we try to do this whenever we are aware that somebody is an early career researcher. Unfortunately, we don't know everybody though, and we can't always tell when when a submission is coming in from an early career researcher. So what we're trying to do in Anatolian Studies is we're trying to trial a system. We're going to ask people to self-identify as early career researchers. An incentive for doing this is that we're thinking of trying to offer a biannual prize for the best research article from an early career researcher. But it will also mean that we just add an extra layer of reviewing support from the editorial team. And that's not just me and my fantastic colleague Gina Coulthard, who's the executive editor, but actually a whole editorial board who are very hands-on for Anatolian Studies. That's extremely helpful. So I think Lynn might mention this as well, but I think we are all thinking of trying to formalize a little bit of additional support for early career researchers when it comes to submissions. Now, just one word I think is relevant to Anatolian Studies in particular, in terms of who we're trying to encourage more submissions from, but actually we are interested in getting more submissions from traditional classicists. As a traditionally more archaeological journal, we're very, very happy to hear from even very traditional classicists who might be interested in working on philological questions, as long as they're related to authors writing about or hailing from Anatolia. Lynn and Peter, any more comments on target audiences and early career researchers, perhaps?
I think you summed that up very well, Naoise. I mean, I think for all of us, we really want to support all our authors, and in particular early career researchers.
I can only agree with that, and no, absolutely. Perhaps the one thing that I would just say is that in the past, the JRS has tended to receive less than its fair share of submissions from female scholars. I mean, it's tradition continues to be the case that a larger proportion of our submissions come from male scholars than one would expect to be the case, given the gender dynamics of the field more generally. So we would particularly encourage female scholars, and I suppose in particular early careers female scholars, but all female scholars to consider submitting to the JRS.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, I think we all want to encourage a diversity of people, and certainly in JHS, we've had the same issues, that there are just fewer submissions from women, and we're very happy to see more. And of course, what I'm going to go on to talk about in the peer reviewing, nobody knows who you are. So whatever your background, it doesn't matter. They're only looking at the quality of the piece. Shall I move seamlessly on then to the next bit, right, which is about the process? And I'll try and be quick on this so we can leave plenty of time for questions. Now, all of our journals have guidelines for contributors, and I've recently revamped ours, and they're all available online. Mine are available up on the Cambridge Core website so you always make sure that you read the guidelines for contributors before you actually decide to submit or think about how you finalize your article for submission, because that's actually quite important. And a lot of the things that we've said today are also in those guidelines. There is also a JHS style sheet. JHS has its own particularly idiosyncratic house style, which, as it is a house style, one can't change very much, though I think I will update it slightly in the coming year, just to clarify some of the things that are there. And the process is very straightforward. In the case of JHS and JRS, at the moment, you simply send your contribution to the editor, that is to me or to Peter. In the case of Anatolian Studies, it goes to Gina Coulthard, the executive editor, but there's really not very much difference. Now, JHS, I hope, is going to move on to online submission maybe later this year, but for now, any contributions, just send to the editors. Normally in JHS, the editor reads over the submissions that come in, and virtually all of our submissions, except for a very, very tiny number, are sent out to 2 referees for blind peer review. The ones that are not sent out, people still get a full letter with full feedback from a specialist. So it's not as if they're just being rejected out of hand and given no support, because that would be mean. But they're normally papers, and there, as I say, there are very few of them that are just simply, for one reason or another, not suitable for the journal or not fully developed as a scholarly article for the journal, but people still get proper feedback. Normally, with the review process, I'm allowing 1 month for reviewers now, but over the past year with COVID and all of the extra burdens that academics have had, not surprisingly, a lot of people have really struggled with journal reviewing. I mean, all of us have struggled with everything, who hasn't? And so in other journals that I edit for, as well as JHS, reviewers have just taken a little bit more time than usual to get back, and it slowed the review process. Ideally, we want reviews back within a month and a reasonable turnaround time, but this year it just hasn't always been possible. We have very clear guidelines for reviewers, And we want reviewers to be rigorous, but also to give really useful, helpful, supportive feedback, both for papers that need revision or submission, even if they're accepted, as well as for papers that we reject. And again, as for the Journal of Roman Studies, we have quite a high rejection rate, but that is absolutely no reason why you shouldn't submit your article. If you don't submit, you're sure not to get in. Just try it. Even if you don't get into the journal, even if your paper is rejected, you will still get extensive and helpful feedback on it. Basically, the options for referees are accept with minor corrections, revise and resubmit, that is, make some major changes, or reject. And resubmissions, we want them to come back in formatted to that JHS house style. And we would normally send revised and resubmitted papers out to referees again to make sure that referees are happy that the things that they've asked for have been dealt with. Once a paper is edited by the editor and we have an agreed final version, now in JHS, and this is an innovation, we send it straight to production, which is the wonderful Gina Coulthard, our production editor. The author will get proofs and it will go up online ASAP. Now, again, like JHS and Anatolian Studies, we've normally published about over 10 articles in JHS last year. Some of the article submissions have become very, very long, like 25,000 words. And yeah, exactly. And longer is not always better. And we have now instituted a target word limit, and it is only a target. We're quite flexible about this, of around 9,000 words. And we will accept longer papers if that extra length is justified. But we're also encouraging authors much more to use the wonderful facilities of digital publishing, like supplementary material. So if you have lots of tables or something like a commentary that goes with an inscription or something like that, or a catalog that goes with an archaeological article, rather than putting that right in the text, we would put that in supplementary material, which is available online. It'll be right there with the paper. And it's great because you have a lot more flexibility in terms of the format. So you can put up Excel charts or GIS maps or all sorts of cool things, which is brilliant. The other thing is that, and maybe this is just me personally, I am trying to discourage people from having really, really long footnotes. If it's really important, put it in the text. If it's not that important, then just refer to it and then don't bother. Or develop it as an appendix and put it in supplementary material. There are all sorts of ways to do this. And of course, anything that goes in supplementary material is beyond the word limit. Normally, the paper issue for JHS comes out at the end of the calendar year. But what I'm aiming to do is to make sure that in future, at least, this is a transition year, everybody's papers that are going into a particular issue are up online way before that, because you guys need your papers out quickly if you're writing for us. Anything to add, Peter and Nish?
Can I just absolutely underline and support what Lynn says about length? I mean, probably one of the most common responses that I get from my referees is, this is an interesting paper, but it's 14,000 words and it really needs to be 6,500 words. It's absolutely the case that just because we do occasionally publish papers up to 15,000 words, it's actually a very, very unusual topic that needs that amount of space to breathe. We love you better if you're shorter. And the other, perhaps just one final thing to add. I think our refereeing process is broadly very similar to that Lynn's laid out. Just one thing I'd say about the specialism of referees. It's actually rather unlike being refereed for a journal like ours can be a little bit unlike having your work read by your doctoral supervisor, in that if you're submitting us a piece on Censorinus's De Die Natali, we may well not go to one of the other two world specialists on Censorinus to get extremely detailed technical feedback on technical points. The paper may well be read by 2 or 3 generalist Roman historians and literary scholars who aren't particularly specialists in that field. And I think that's a justifiable process, because we hope that papers in our journal will be of interest to someone other than the two other world specialists on Censorinus. So it may well be that the kind of referee feedback that you're getting will be, this is all very well, but I just don't see why this would be of interest to people other than those three people who work on the field. And that's not because we can't be bothered to send the paper to a extremely technical specialist. It's because one of the things that we're most interested in is how interested non-specialists are reacting to your work. So I think it's just an important point to make about what peer review is for. It's not really about us picking up typos and little sort of technical mistakes. What we want to get is a sense of how a non-specialist might be responding to this your argument.
I think just to add to that, I might just say that a word on the, if you do get what looks like a rejection pre-review, that's not necessarily a rejection per se. It is often an opening of a discussion, right? And we're all, I think, really happy to continue discussions about the shape and the emphasis of different articles, and also often to help you place an article in the journal which is best for that article. I mean, that it's absolutely, there can be fantastic bits of work which are just not right for a journal, or it would work better somewhere else, and that is part of what we're here to do. So if you are in any doubt, I think the answer is to send things to us, even an informal email, get in touch, and we can let you know whether it fits or whether it doesn't fit, and we can just begin that discussion. It is the opening of a discussion. It is not the final click, as it were.
Thank you, Naoise. I'm just going to jump in there. I'm Christian from Cambridge University Press, if you joined after the point at which I finished speaking. I just wondered if you had anything further to add on the points you've already talked about, or whether you'd like me to dive straight into the question and answer session. We've had a few things in already, and Peter has been extremely active at answering all those. But I'll go over a couple of them for the benefit of everybody attending the webinar, and to allow our other panelists the chance possibly to comment. The first one was a question for Peter from Martha, and she asked, would JRS be interested in modern historiography? My research is based on the biography of a 20th century British Romanist, also a VP of the Roman Society, and Martha's at the University of Durham. So Peter, you had already offered some insight into that.
Yeah, no, and we actually had a similar question about that came in shortly afterwards about whether JHS and JRS are interested in publishing on reception topics. And
absolutely,
the answer in both cases, certainly from the JRS's perspective, is as it happens in the past, we haven't published many papers either on modern historiography or on reception topics. But that's not because of a lack of will. It's simply that people have tended not to submit papers to us in those fields. And one thing that I think the JRS in particular actually has suffered from is that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the journal had a particular focus on sort of institutional history and political history. That means that people working in areas like reception studies or modern historiography may have got the sense, looking at the journal, that it tends not to be for them. In fact, we're positively keen to publish more in that area. I think the only piece that immediately springs to mind is a really nice piece by Chris Stray in JRS 2010 on Roman studies in the UK in the 20th century. I mean, a paper that, as much as anything, I think just shows how much interesting stuff there is still to be done in that area. So yeah, I mean, if people wanted to, if people have topics in reception studies broadly conceived or in modern historiography, I'm absolutely very, very happy to receive papers in those areas.
Yeah, and ditto JHS. I mean, we happily would publish on reception studies. We just tend not to receive as much, but totally interesting. And there was a question that came in about Ptolemaic studies as well that I saw, and the answer is absolutely yes. I've got something out under review on Ptolemaic sculpture at the moment, which is really interesting, and there are other things as well. So, absolutely.
I wondered whether you each would mind telling us a little bit about the publishing that's coming up in each of the journals and how it reflects the time that we're currently in, possibly, or the time that we've gone through, as well as the future direction for the journals. Do you want to kick in with that one, Naoise?
I'm not sure we have a particular COVID journal coming up for you next year, but we have had a bizarrely high number of submissions following the first lockdown period. So we've been particularly busy with reviewing recently. But I think when it comes to where we're going, the kind of future directions, I think actually probably all of us in our previous conversations have been talking about wanting to expand the boundaries of what it is that we're doing. And I think one of the interesting things is that I'm here in this conversation, and this fits in with wider conversations that have been happening across classics as a discipline about what the boundaries of classics are, what classics should be. Should we be including Ptolemaic things? Should we be including Anatolian things? And I do think that certainly, I mean, Lynn and Peter have both been at the forefront of pushing the boundaries of their respective disciplines. And I think that all of our journals will be hoping to do this, to push out, to work interdisciplinarily, and to open ourselves up more. I don't want to speak for you guys out of turn, but I get the feeling this is probably where we're all looking.
No, absolutely. In our case, I mean, JRS, if you look back over the early issues of JHS, there's just a huge range of different topics that don't show up in later issues. And many of those, it would be great to see more of. Again, I mean, you know, we tend to get a lot of papers that are more, as it were, at the art historical end or visual culture end of archaeology. We get fewer archaeological papers. And as somebody who is fundamentally an archaeologist and doesn't do the art stuff really, I would like to see more of that kind of thing. We want diversity. We want current issues. We want all of these things. And I think what we all want is cutting edge. You know, we want to be publishing the stuff that's absolutely at the forefront of the many subfields that we cover in a way that is appealing and accessible to a wide range of readers.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that. I mean, entirely agree with both Naoise and Lynn. And I don't think I would want to be shaping the JRS's content and saying, you know, what we want is to be, you know, focusing more on Roman imperial history, because that's where I think, you know, things are at. I mean, we want to be publishing where the field is at. You know, so we're listening to you rather than determining where we think the journals should go.
And on that note, Javier Williams and Melody Lee have just offered two more questions kind of around topics that they're interested in and asking whether they would be suitable for the journals. So Javier, for example, is asking about later antiquity and the Roman deconstruction for JRS, and Melody is asking about interdisciplinary research which crosses both Roman and Hellenic studies, for example, ancient medicine, and where best those sorts of papers might publish.
Yeah, for the JRS, I mean, our lower end is kind of fuzzy. I mean, we regularly publish a couple of articles each year on late antique topics, particularly the late antique West, but not only the West. I mean, I don't imagine we publish a paper on Charlemagne. Whether we would publish a paper on sort of the early Burgundian kingdoms or the Visigoths, I suppose the answer would be yes. That would be out on the margins of what we do, but certainly positively keen to get papers in the long late antiquity, if not perhaps the very long late antiquity.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, what you guys out there as authors want is to make sure that the right people in your field are going to read the article. So just because we will publish something doesn't mean we're always the best place. On the other hand, we as selfish journal editors really do want to be very inclusive. So, you know, again, as Naoise said, this is very much part of a discussion. As it happens, JHS publishes quite a lot in late antiquity, which is really good. We have a lot that has been published last year and in the last few years. I have a lot of submissions in process at the moment that focus around late antiquity and go right up into Byzantine studies, and that is great. And some of the Byzantine things that are coming in are really exciting and really good, and of much wider interest than just the Byzantine scholars.
Nisha, do you have anything to add at all?
No, I think we traditionally, because we have a broader chronological span, we've always had late antiquity. Actually, next year, or rather this year, 2021, we actually have quite a few late antique and Byzantine papers. We've got a little kind of concentration of them. I think the Byzantinist and late antique specialists have been very productive in the last 24 months. So well done, all you guys.
Yeah, and ancient medicine clearly fits right across the piece, depending on the focus of the piece, really. Very happy to publish things on ancient medicine. It's a very exciting topic, and there's a lot of very cool stuff going on.
Franz Doppere asks, what is your position on open access of the supporting data? Is it required to deposit data in repositories at the same time of publication in one of your journals?
It's a perfectly reasonable question. I worry slightly that actually answering that would giving a full answer, that would take a very long time, and the answers will probably be slightly different for the different journals. So, Fran, sorry, in a sense to sort of bat you away. I'm very happy to give a written reply afterwards, but perhaps those sort of technical things about open access might be something to reply in writing afterwards. If others are happy with that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Also, I think
there's a long, complicated answer to this. Is the short answer.
These things are also changing from volume to volume. Actually, the guidance and the legal position on open access is changing. So I would recommend asking about it in writing at the time of submission. Don't ask it 6 months before you submit, because it could change 6 months later.
Yeah.
And it's worth pointing out that on Cambridge Core, we have a dedicated hub with all of the current up-to-date information about open access. We'll include some links to that page and those resources in our follow-up email to attendees. We're kind of drawing towards the end of the session. Was there anything that you, Lynn, Peter, or Nisha wanted to add to the discussion today? Any points that you feel you wanted to cover and haven't so far?
No, I think the only thing that I would want to add is that one of the things we've talked about collectively as editors is really just working more together, you know, where the question that was asked about interdisciplinary topics, which could go in potentially any of the 3 journals, is a very good one. We recognize that very positive kind of overlap. We've talked about doing things like perhaps some article collections, drawing on articles on particular themes in the past, that where we could be drawing articles, for example, around a topic like Roman Asia Minor, for example, or Hellenistic and Roman Asia Minor, that would draw on articles from all 3 journals. I think we would just all like to make sure that we're all working together in future. And I mean, of course, JHS and JRS run in parallel in one sense anyway, because of the way that we're sponsored. But Anatolian Studies is also very relevant and very closely aligned. Anything else to add on that, guys, that you can think of?
Not really. I think another thing that we've been talking about over the last kind of year or so is aligning a greater sense of alignment across different journals when it comes to processes and guidelines, ethical guidelines, things like dispute resolution, how to deal with, and again, with our support for early career researchers and formalizing this. This is something that I think we are interested in working across journals to make sure that we improve the situation for everyone, not just journal by journal, but all together.
No, and with CUP itself, because you know, obviously Cambridge University Press publishes a lot of journals, and I have certainly found that the Christian and the other people that we work with at the press often have very, very good advice on the basis of their experience on some of these things as well. It's very helpful.
And I suppose just a general point tying those together, that we would, I think, warmly encourage, I mean, any scholar, but particularly career scholars, to get in touch with us informally. I mean, you don't have to, the first contact doesn't have to be, and possibly shouldn't be, here is my article in its final form, please go and referee it. Actually, even just a brief email saying, you know, I'm writing an article on this topic, it's about this length, it's on this subject, is this likely to be something you might be interested in refereeing for the journal? it saves us a great deal of time if we can say, actually, that sounds like something that might be better directed towards this journal, or yes, but it would need to be half the length for us to consider it. So we're absolutely happy to receive, sort of positively keen to receive informal approaches of that kind, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would second that entirely.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for all of those really wonderfully interesting insights that you've given us today. I also want to thank, as we now wrap up this webinar, everybody who's attended the session. Thank you again to Lynn, Peter and Nisha for your time today. We really, really appreciate it, and we hope to have you on board for another session in the future.